All right, welcome back to the never-ending rear axle installation. We're finally there. Third time's a charm. The 8.8 Fox body axle is perfect. It's perfect. So, it's mocked up. This is a 273 Posi out of the Fox body. I just have the control arms just loose, bolted up. They're just there to locate the rear. They're not, nothing's welded, nothing like that. But what I've done is the rear is set to ride height. It's centered in the car. I have my shims, some wood and some metal on both sides. So that note tells me I have about 1.25 inches on the inside. Well, that might be, yeah, about 1.25 inches on the inside, and at least 1.5 inches on the outside. It looks real good. Lots of room on both sides. And again, this is with those high offset wheels. 4 inches offset to this section, and if you measure all the way out to the outer lip, it's about 4.25. And so most wheels don't have that much offset, so if I put some Kragers or something on here, it'll probably kick it to the outside a 1/2 inch. Plenty of room, works perfect. All right, so fine. Time to install this rear. No more screwing around, changing rear axles. All right, so it's located with the truck arms, just to keep it where it's gonna be. And on the stands, obviously, holding it up, I have my pinion set to 3 degrees up. Okay, if I can get that on there. But that baby is at 3 degrees. All right, facing up. And I already have the car level front to back, which is going to be what it'll be about at driving, at ride height. I expect the car to be level when I'm driving it. I don't think it's going to be ass up or anything like that, or have a rake to it in any way, but I guess we'll find out. But right now I'm going to set that to 3 degrees up, and I'm going to, first step now will be to locate my spring purchase. Now that the axle is where I want it, I have my pinion where I want it. And again, pinion should be set with the car at right angle. You know, as far as your rake, if you're going to run the car with a rake with the back up, you should set your pinion angle with the car at that angle. I do that after the car is on the ground and the engine's in and everything's set. That's usually when I set my pinion angle. But I know things are going to be pretty much here. So I've got the car level. I've got my pinion set to 3 degrees. Now I want to set these level. I'm going to have to use a torpedo and get the... that's sucking at videos. Use a torpedo level with the center line of my spring mount up there. Line that up with the center of my mount. Mark the rear axle, then put the level on it, get it level front to back, and weld her in. So I know that that will be in the correct place with my pinion at 3 degrees up, and that will locate the spring where it needs to be. After those are installed, then I'm going to work on placement of these arms. There is still a little side-to-side movement in these things, even when they're bolted up tight up front, which they are. There is a little bit of wiggle room, so they don't. It's not like you just bolt that up in the front, cinch it tight, and these don't move anymore. These things still can move side to side, but this has to go first. Get the spring mounts in, so I know where my U-bolt's going to be. Because if I did this first and had my U-bolt in the way of the spring mount, that's not going to work. So that's getting first. So I'll get those burned in, and then we'll come back. It's hard to video this kind of stuff under a car like this, so I'm just going to do what I said, use a torpedo, locate them, burn them in. Okay, so I put the spring perches in, tack welded those in place, got the arms in a happy spot. Like I said, they move back and forth a little bit, put them like right in the middle of their travel, tack welded those in, and then unbolted the arms, lowered the rear axle down a little bit, and burned everything in. So now the pads are welded on for the springs, and the perches for the arms are welded in. Sorry I couldn't get video on that. I don't know if anybody really wants to watch me welding, but the problem is underneath a car like this is just not a lot of room, and because right now my garage is totally overloaded with too much junk, there's just no room to get a camera set up far away. Maybe that'll change as I start getting rid of things, but whatever. So right now, with all that stuff welded in, and I have my wedges holding the axle centered in the car, next thing is going to be the Panhard bar. So the mount we're going to reuse is obviously there on the car, and we're going to tie over here to the frame, to the rear axle. And I'm probably going to have to shorten the Panhard a little bit from the factory length. We'll check it out in a minute. But one thing I wanted to say was rear springs. This is the second 55 Buick I've done. And in both instances, the factory rear springs were no longer usable after changing the rear suspension. You set it up with those springs in there and let the car down, and the thing is jacked up in the air like freaking 6 inches. I mean, it's way high. And all I can think is that the original rear axle and torque tube is so heavy, and then you replace it with something really light, that they're just no longer any good as far as spring rate or anything. They're just way too much. So on my other one, I used a set of, I believe, A-body 68 to 72 El Camino springs, because I had them from a parts car years ago, because I'm a hoarder. They worked out fantastic. And also because I'm a hoarder, I have these. These are from a 1984 El Camino, and they look good. I put them in just, loosely, didn't bolt them in or anything, and lowered the car down, and the ride height looks spot on. So I'm going to use these. Got to clean them off, obviously, when we come time to clean everything and paint them. But they are probably cargo springs with the, cargo. I don't know if they're cargo or just dual spring rate because of the coils, the way they wind them like that. But they work real good as far as what it looks like. So those are the springs I'm going to use. Obviously, I don't have them in right now because I need to compress the suspension, because we got to do this Panhard bar. And one thing I wanted to mention is the reason I'm doing everything at ride height. Like, I set up my spring perches at ride height, I set up my axle pads at ride height, and now I'm going to do the Panhard at ride height, is because the suspension moves on an arc. This is actually going to swing. I mean, you've got a pivot point in the front, and then think about it, this arm is going to go like this. So if it's not right where you want it for ride height, the axle location's not going to be where it's supposed to be. So your spring pads will be off, things will be off. Now, especially for the Panhard bar, you want the axle at ride height to set this up, and the Panhard bar should be as level as possible, parallel to the rear axle. And that's because, just like the suspension, the Panhard bar moves in an arc. So if you have a fixed point and then it swings up and down, it's actually going to move the axle side to side. And you want it to be set up at ride height, because if not, when you set the car down on ride height, the Panhard's going to swing and it's going to pull the axle left or right. So I have the axle centered, I have it at ride height, and now it's time to see what it's going to look like as far as the mount for the rear axle. Alright, so time for a Panhard bar. So just a quick check. I've got the original Panhard bar just slid on the stud over there. This is my original mount. I set this here and swing my Panhard bar up. I can see that the Panhard bar is now too long, because it must be, originally this mount must have been way over here where the truck arm mount is now, so I can't use that spot anymore. So I got to shorten the Panhard. So just looking at it, I just made a little mark about how much it needs to be shortened. So I'm going to shorten this thing and then come back and do it again. And once this is shortened, then I'll locate this bracket here. I'm going to shorten it as little as possible, but just to be safe, I'll probably take a 1/4 inch more off of my mark in case I can't read a tape measure or angles change and makes a difference. So I'm going to chop the Panhard bar. All right, so in the middle of narrowing the Panhard bar, I figured like 2 inches, take 2 inches out. So I actually took out like 2 1/8 and beveled the edges. You don't want to just butt this stuff together and weld it. You want to put a bevel on them. You also just don't want to weld it together like that. So you need a slug, a piece of metal to put inside each side to stabilize it and weld it all together. So it's Sunday. I don't have a slug. So what do? This is the 2-inch section that I cut out of the Panhard bar. All I did was slice it a few times, squeeze it together to make it a little smaller diameter. And now it fits inside with one hand. I don't know, but trust me, it's a tight fit. But yeah, it'll fit inside the tube for support. Then I'll just stick it together with a slight gap so I can burn it all together in one shot. And then it just makes it a lot stronger than just butt welding this stuff together. So we'll get that welded and then go back to checking on the mount position again. For the Panhard, couldn't weld it on the floor because I forgot that there's the angles in the pipe and I didn't mark them before I just chopped it. So easy enough to take care of, not a problem. So just put this together, bolt it together in its mount. Swing this up, put the sleeve together, put it where it wants to be. I'll give myself a little gap in the slug there and get everything straight. Weld the bracket to the axle and then tack this together and to put it on the floor and weld it up for the final time. Okay, Panhard bar is done. All welded back together. Mounted up to the factory locations. Looks good. And everything is rock solid. So no more side to side play. Panhard bar, keep the axle from moving. So rear suspension now is done, except for rear shocks. Have to put rear shocks on this, and then the springs can go in. And of course the shocks can't be in the way of the springs, so keep that in mind as doing work. So next thing will be the rear shocks. Okay, so quick overview of where we are with the rear suspension. So put in the 2x4 steel cross member, made tabs out of 1/4 plate, truck arm suspension, boxed the rear sections of the rails, and I bolted the rear springs in. So all that's left to do are the rear shock mounts. One thing I just wanted to go over, the only reason I was able to do my final welding on the perches here to the axle is because this is a truck arm suspension and not a leaf spring suspension. The truck arms move in an arc. You know, if you imagine a pendulum, they've got a fixed point and they swing up and down. So as long as I had the axle at ride height, which I did. I had it raised up to ride height position on the car. I could set my pinion angle and weld those brackets on. That was with the rear springs out of the car. With the rear springs bolted in, I can't raise the axle back up to the ride height position because it just starts lifting the car off the lift. But what I had done was, when I had the axle on the car, I basically just took a measurement. Try to do this with one hand here. When I had the axle in ride height position, I took a quick measurement from the fender, the quarter panel opening rather, to the axle center line, and I was around 14 inches. And right now, I don't know, call it 16 and a half. So I'm like 2.5 inches lower than ride height, and I need to know that for my rear shock mounting points. But I think I'm getting off on a tangent here. What I wanted to say was, if you do a rear suspension and you use leaf springs, don't weld these perches onto the axle. Wait until you have the car done on the ground and sitting on the ground at ride height. Then set your pinion angle and you can weld your perches on, because leaf springs are different. Obviously, on leaf springs you have one fixed point and then the other end is connected to the shackle, and the leaf spring gets longer and shorter with suspension cycle, and also changes its curve. I mean, it's going to flatten out. So your pinion angle changes as the leaf spring compresses and unloads. So that 3 degrees you want, and or whatever you use, generally I go with 3, but I've had situations where I had to go 4 or 5, but let me get into that. But I just wanted to explain that for a 4-link you could do it this way, but not for a leaf spring suspension. Make sure that you have the car loaded on the ground and you set your pinion angle. And usually I don't even set the pinion angle until after the engine and transmission are in place and I know what that angle is. Generally, I set the drivetrain with the tail of the transmission 3 degrees pointing down toward the ground, and the pinion 3 degrees pointing toward the sky, and that's at ride height. I know for drag racing, you know, with leaf spring, they'll say make the pinion point down to the ground and not up. Well, I build street cars. Nothing is dedicated drag car. That's for axle wrap up and such, and I don't do that. I build street cars, and if it's going to get raced, fine, but it's primarily a street car, so I set them with the engine down at its angle and the pinion up in the equal angle. The only time I've not been able to do 3 degrees is I did an LT1 in my 47 Cadillac, and I needed room for the AC compressor, and I had to get a little more angle in that, so that was actually 5 degrees down, so I set the pinion 5 degrees up to match it. And I've had nothing but good luck, no issues with vibrations, highway speeds, 80 miles an hour, whatever, all smooth. So that's the deal. So that's why I was able to weld my axle perches now, because it's a truck arms type suspension, and I could set my pinion angle at ride height. Nothing's going to change at ride height when I set it on the ground. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but basically just a warning: if you do a leaf spring suspension, don't weld your perches or set your pinion angle until you have the car down on the ground with the suspension loaded and you can see where your angles really are. Any questions, you can always ask. I'm no pro builder, but so far what I've done has worked. That was probably way confusing. I try. This is what I can do. Anyway, so like I said, I bolted the springs into the car. I raised the axle up as high as I could without starting to lift the car off the lift, and that's about 2.5 inches lower than ride height. The reason that's important is because I have to make shock mounts, figure out what kind of shock to use. You know, my gauge is falling off here. And I need to know those measurements. So ideally, I want my shock to be at mid-travel at ride height, and I want at least 3 inches of travel either way. The biggest thing with the shock is you don't want the shock to be your limiter as far as suspension. That's why you have bump stops. If your shock absorber is what limits your suspension, you are going to break things. So if I grab a tape measure, which I have one over here, let's just see. All right, so right now I've got a factory cross member up there above the rear axle. Let me extend this here. Let's see. So measuring from, we'll call it up there, down to the axle. It's behind, my measurement's behind it, but I'm about 12 inches to the center. I could probably just do it this way. From this side, yeah, call it 13. So call it 13 inches to the center of the tube, and I'm about 2.5 inches below ride height. So you're talking 10.5 inches to center. So 10.5 center of travel. I want it to be able to compress at least 3 inches. So then you're talking 7.5 inches for compression, and let's say, and 13.5 for extension, at least. That's to get an idea of compressed length versus extended length. So to pick a shock, I usually go on online. I downloaded a Monroe shock absorber book, and you can find something that will work in your range for compression and extension and do the job for you. But since I'm a parts hoarder, I'm not going to do that this time. What I have is a pair of shocks. These are a pair of shocks out of a 4th generation F-body, 93 to 97, probably the same all the way up to 2002, but I know they're out of a 93 to 97 Z28 or Trans Am. Rear shocks. And I like these shocks for a couple reasons. One, they've got the stud mount for the top, which means you can mount it and be able to angle it, you know, for your lower mount position. It doesn't have to be like in a rigid straight line up and down. It's easier to get an angle shock on it. And they have the stud mount on the bottom, which works pretty good. The other thing is, I know shock absorbers are a major item for tuning your suspension, and they say mismatched shocks can mess up your ride and this and that and whatever. And all I can say is, for the street cars that I build, I throw in whatever shocks I have, swap meet buy, parts car buy, and as long as the travel is good, I've had no issues. If you're going to build something that you think, you know, shocks are important for your tuning, then, you know, buy adjustable shocks or something. Get something that will work for you. In my case, I'm going to use these Z28 shocks. And one thing that's cool about that is, just because a Z28 is a performance car, you could buy aftermarket shocks for the Z28. So if I wanted to get something more high-tech, more zoomy type stuff, all I do is look up shocks for a Z28, and I'm sure the aftermarket will have something. Now, am I going to need that? Probably not, because I'd rather have this thing just, you know, spin the tires and have some fun with it. But anyway, let me get some measurements on these shocks and see what I'm working with. All right, so, well, first thing, other than my axle being 2.5 inches lower than ride height, the other measurements as far as shocks, they're wrong, because I'm measuring or talking to you about off the center of the axle, and that's not where you put your shock mount. So forget that. I'm not good at making videos. I'm used to just doing this work and just banging it out. So anyway, this is how it'll get done. So I just measured these shocks at full extension, which is how they're sitting on the ground here. They are 21.5 inches from where the bushing is center to center line of the stud here, 21.5 inches. When I crush them down and compress them, they are down to 13.5 inches. Okay, so that means that wherever I put my lower mount, as long as my suspension at full compression doesn't compress this thing all the way, it'll be safe. And as far as extension, it'll never be at full extension. I know that. I'm not going to Dukes of Hazzard this car and get the rear suspension at full extension. So the only time it'll go at rear full extension is when you jack the car up in the air. The shock will go to full extension and keep the rear axle from falling out of the car. You know, same like Chevelles, same thing. You know, you can't take the rear springs out unless you unbolt the shock and let the rear axle come down. The shock keeps everything in place. So if I just take my shock, and I should probably turn on my light. Hang on a second here. Okay. All right, we have a light. We have a light now. So if I just take my shock absorber, and like I said, I'm going to make a mount or something up here tying off this area where the top of the spring mount is. If I just bolt the shock up in there, you can see I got plenty of length. This shock absorber extends way down past the rear axle. But I could make something, you know, like this at a little angle. Put a piece of steel plate up here at the top to hold the stud, and put something off of that original truck arm shock bracket to hold it. Compress the shock a couple inches and set that up. I just have to keep in mind of where ride height is and just try to keep my extension and compression somewhat centered. So it's going to be almost impossible for me to film this, but I'll try to get some stuff in as work goes on. But basically, I'm going to make a plate at the top up there to hold the top of the shock, and then fabricate something off here to hold the bottom. And the goal is to have this shock somewhat centered at ride height, so it has equal amount of travel up and down. And this has, you said, like 7 inches plus, or 7 inches or so of travel. There's no way I'm gonna bottom this thing out and crush it. That'll be plenty. I should hit the bump stops before then, at least that's the idea. So let me start getting one of these things mounted up, and we'll go from there. Alrighty, so time for rear shocks. So I bolted in the springs, as I said before, mostly so I could see my clearance from where the shocks are going to mount. I have figured out what I'm going to do. Actually, out in my junk pile, I found a cross member. Could even be from a 56 Buick, because they went to tube shocks in 56. I'm not sure. But anyway, I found these shock brackets. And I cut one off the cross member just to take a look. And it's going to work perfectly. So I'll weld a flat plate on the cross member there, so I'll have somewhere to mount, and weld that in. And that'll be that for the tops. And then the shocks will pretty much just be straight. I have to go inside the Panhard bar. Pretty much straight from there. They'll go straight down, and I'll make some mounts that come off of the rear axle to locate the bottom. And we'll see how that goes. Sometimes I'll put an angle in them. I mean, the more you angle the shock, the less effective it is. But I need to keep room for an exhaust as well on this side, and I figure if I keep the shock pretty tight to where the spring's going to be, that'll give me the most room as far as exhaust. I could probably angle them like that. I'll have to see. Won't know till I make final decision, but I'm going to use those mounts that I found, locate off this cross member, and go from there. So let me see what we got to do here. And I will have to remove the springs to put these shocks in. The springs were mostly in just so I could see clearances, but the thing is, with the Panhard bar system, the axle is not going to be centered in the car unless it's at ride height. It's down a little bit right now, which means that the Panhard bar is not level, so the rear is going to be shifted over a little bit. So I don't want to make my lower shock mounts and measure them up evenly with the axle not centered in the car. So I'm going to pull the rear springs back out, raise the axle back up to ride height, and go from there as far as mounts. Okay, so I'm in the middle of making shock mounts, upper mounts at least for now. Just welded in a piece of plate on both sides, and on this side I welded in the upper mount. It's plug welded, so it's not going anywhere, and I put it at a slight angle, and I'll copy that angle on the other one. So now I'm just going to bolt the shock mount, or top of the shock to the mount, compress it halfway, and wherever that lines up on the axle, that's the length of whatever mount I make for the bottom. That'll be next thing to figure out, because the springs are obviously back out of the car, and I have the axle raised up to ride height, so I want the shock to be at mid-range of its travel. So let me get the other one welded on and go from there. Alright, so we have a shock mount on. All I did was bolt the shock up to the upper mount, and then I pushed it up until my midway point line got up to my dust shield. That's my spot, and then I just kind of held it with one hand, stuck a tape measure on it, and measured from the stud up to the track arm, the Panhard bar mount there, and made a template. I took a measurement from where the stud was to the Panhard bar mount, made a template on cardboard, made it out of steel, added some side gussets, and burned her in. And then gotta push. Poof, bolts in. And that's that one. Do the same thing over here. It'll be a little different since there's no Panhard bar mount, but same idea. Mount the shock to the top, push it up till it's at its midway point, measure from the axle down to the stud, make a template, go from there. It should be almost the same. There's only an 1/8 inch difference because of this plate here, so it should be just about the same size. I'll check my template I already made and see if it works. See why I wear this old junk flannel? Yeah, fire. Alright, the rear suspension's done. Made the second shock mount, same as the first. Shocks are in. I tested at full droop. When the shocks at full extension, springs can't come out. So if I wanted, I could change these spring mounts. Instead of having them bolt into the car, I could put cups on the rear and on the top like they did in the late 60s, so the springs pretty much just sit in there real quick. You don't even have to use a wrench to take them out. You just take the shocks off, lower the axle. But I think this will be fine for now. But that's it. We're done. So just to overall reminisce, what did we do? Okay, so put in the big 2x4 3/16 wall front cross member. Removed the rear half of the frame X's, boxed off the ends, made tabs out of 1/4 inch steel for the front mounts for the arms. These are 1960 to 1972 Chevy C10 pickup arms. Got the purchase online new. Still have this original U-bolts in here. I may buy new. There's nothing wrong with these, but we'll see. Rear axle is a Fox body Mustang 273 posi, so that's 70, what is that? 79 to like 92, or 86 to 92. I think 86 is when they started using 8.8, so maybe 86 to 92 for the axle. Fox body anyway, Mustang. Rear springs are out of a 1984 El Camino. I don't know if they're stock. They are definitely, what do you say? They've got 2 different spring rates there, so whatever, multi-spring rate springs. The rear shocks are out of a 4th gen 1993 to 1997 Camaro Z28. Shock mounts are homemade. Upper mounts are homemade because I don't know where they came from. Found them in my pile. Could have been from enough different C10 truck. I just don't know. Panhard bar is the original bar, shortened about 1 inch. Original Panhard bar mount. And right now the Panhard bar is an angle because the rear axle is hanging all the way down. When I set the car down, the Panhard will come up level. And that is about it. So that is it for rear suspension right now. Back here again to take it apart for paint and all that at another point. But it's time to move on to new projects on the car and get this thing going. It's coming out. It's coming out for the first time with the new suspension. All right. Looks pretty cool. I like it. So that's where the wheel sits in the arch with those El Camino springs. Looks good. Looks good. Ugh. There we go. Shocks are sitting right about where I marked them. Looks good. Panhard bar's as level as I could get it for the length. Looks good. Very cool. Looks like an ugly old hot rod, which is pretty cool. It's just what I wanted. Pretty neat. But they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I like it. Hope you like it. More stuff coming soon. I got to get the Mustang parted out and gone. So that'll take me a few days to get that stripped out, and got to go back to work too. So probably a total of about a week to get it in and out and gone. And then we get back on this beast. See you then.